Joining us is Jordan Buna, a former gang member who has transformed his life and now dedicates his time to gang prevention and youth education.
None of the people in my family or in my life were involved in gangs or crime or anything like that. So there was no predestination for me to end up there. The fact that young middle-class people get involved in gangs, right? That young middle-class people who have other opportunities still gravitate towards the gang lifestyle. And there's a few reasons for that. The first reason that I truly believe is the ease of access, the ease of entry into the drug trade. And it becomes this endless pursuit of money, of pleasure, but ultimately, day to day, it seems like an endless pursuit of money and pleasure, but looking back, it's a numbing that takes place.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Well Informed, the podcast where we dive deep into important topics and bring you conversations with inspiring individuals who are making a difference. I'm your host, Colton Easton, and today we have a very special guest with us. Joining us is Jordan Buna, a former gang member who has transformed his life and now dedicates his time to gang prevention and youth education. So Jordan's journey from a life of crime to then getting a degree in criminology and a master's of psychology is nothing short of remarkable. He works with the Combined Forces Special Enforcement Unit to deliver anti-gang presentations to high school students, sharing his personal experiences to deter youth from making the same mistakes he did. So in today's episode, we dive deep into Jordan's past, his history, what led him down that pathway to getting involved in gangs, but more importantly, what were some of the things he needed and that he uses in his practice today to get youth off of that pathway, to make sure that there's other ways that they can go about living their life, not just that one tunnel, that one pathway of gang violence. So it's a really engaging conversation. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you so much for listening. Jordan, welcome to the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you. I'm glad we got this date nailed down after a couple scheduling issues. Definitely, absolutely my fault.
Yeah, it's all good.
But no, it's really exciting to have you here. I think being able to talk about especially because we were just talking about before, the Canadian side of things. Because again, people think Canada, they think North America, they think, there's so many different sides, especially to the negative youth gangs, the peer groups that are coming up and think that Canada doesn't really have gangs. There's no issue like that. But obviously your story is the complete opposite of that. So what I really want to kind of unfurl is just what got you started, like where, basically front to back, what do you do now? Yeah. What do you do now and what was kind of back then?
Yeah, the old myth that we don't have gangs in Canada is it's like the dark north, Mm-hmm. And we have such a thriving, easily accessible drug trade here, and I think that is one of the key factors that drives gang involvement here. But in terms of what I do now, so I'm a registered clinical counselor. I have a master's degree in counseling psychology. Certainly wasn't where I thought I'd be at one point in my life, but honestly, my main passion is working with individuals, but especially young people. I wear a ton of different hats. My private practice services contracts everything from, people who have had negative contacts with the law. But in my day job, my passion is really working with youth. And it's really what I'm passionate about is trying to be the person that I didn't have growing up, right? Because one of the things that I reflect on about being a young person, and one of the things that I reflect on about what the mechanics were, one of the main drivers for me going down that path of gang involvement was I liken it to almost being time blind when I was young. I thought about tomorrow and maybe the next day after, but that was about it, kind of thing, right? So what I kind of needed was a touchstone to reality, was a touchstone for somebody to say, hey, you're going to pay for every decision that you make along the way. You're going to have to answer for that. Right? Whether you call it karma, whether you call it fate, whether you call it choice and consequence, an if-then statement almost, you'll have to pay for all that stuff, right? So what my main passion is really working with youth to try and help identify what their barriers are, but over and above those barriers, because those barriers exist in everybody's life to some degree, really trying to identify what their strengths are and what they're good at and what they're passionate about, and how do we feed and motivate that, right? How do we create hooks in a youth's life to pull them down a path that's positive as opposed to negative? And really, that's ultimately what I'm passionate about.
That's awesome. And I think, that's a really good point you hit on, the figuring out what are those positives, because so many youth are resilient and they want to be able to share the things that they like, that they're good at, but maybe they don't necessarily know what those are.
Yeah.
And you look at the flip side of what is the allure of that kind of criminality side of things.
Yeah.
And that allure is just so easily identifiable, because I think it just hits some of those basic needs of, like, you want money, you want kinship, you want friendship. Yeah. Like that's all there, and that's so easily, as you said, easily attainable.
Well, and it's interesting too, because, one of the things that I'm passionate about, based on like my understanding of my own behavior, as well as working with hundreds of people over the years, is the realization that, you got to look at people's strengths, but you have to realize that nobody gets up in the morning and says, I want to have a really crappy day today. I really want my life to turn out like crap. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so it's the realization that every behavior, even if it's maladaptive, even if it's negative, to that person exhibiting it, it's meeting some need of theirs, right? So you get back to the basics of what draws people into gang, like some of the things that you were hitting on, things like status, money, power, all of these things, right? So those are all pretty universal needs, right? Mm-hmm. So how can we teach somebody to meet those needs in a pro-social way? How can we teach somebody to meet those needs in a way that they can get up in the morning and say, hey, I don't have the police knocking at my door. Hey, I don't have to worry about going to jail. Hey, I don't have to worry about getting shot today, right? Mm-hmm. Because those are all basic human needs that can be met in other ways. So it's understanding how you can meet those needs, because I still have those same needs that I had when I was younger.
Right.
I just meet them in different ways now.
Right. And it's also the fact that it's also teaching them that they are capable themselves of creating those needs as well. And I mean, it's just there's so many tools and skills and foundations that really need to be to be taught and built up upon, like starting anew for those things. So, I mean, you mentioned those things that I needed or that I had back in the past. So, to what you're doing now, to what, as you mentioned back then, there's a drastic difference between those two things. So can you talk a little bit about what was kind of your past growing up?
So my past growing up was probably, I would describe it as almost the antithesis of what you would think would be a gang member's past. I come from a 2-parent household. I have uncles, aunts, cousins, a little brother, right? None of the people in my family or in my life were involved in gangs or crime or anything like that. So there was no like predestination for me to end up there. This was not a story of abject poverty. This was not a story of familial gang membership kind of thing that, my path was kind of set in stone from the beginning. But for me, there was risk factors in my life early on. And one of the biggest risk factors for me was the fact that when I was really young, I was diagnosed with ADHD, right? And it's not that ADHD made me act. It's not that it was a predestination for me to make certain choices, but it conditioned me to behave in such a way that caused me to get into a lot of trouble, right? So I remember grades 1 to 6, I was a really good kid, right? Like I played lots of sports. I did pretty well in school. My teachers all had great things to say about me. But then grade 7 came and a lot of things changed. And I remember they started to change pretty quickly. I went from being that pretty good kid to all of a sudden, I became really disobedient at school, really disobedient at home, right? I started to get into a lot of conflict, both at home and at school, right? And it wasn't very long before the adults in my life obviously had noticed something was wrong, right? And so, I was taken to a doctor, did some testing, was eventually diagnosed with ADHD, was put on medication for it. And, the medication did help. But a lot of like what drew me into like toward the lifestyle of not fitting in, of feeling like I was out of place all the time, was that ADHD diagnosis, because it made me behave in such a way that to be honest with you, I felt like I stuck out like a sore thumb all the time.
Right. Because people who have that diagnosis, they learn very differently. Or when something feels so easily understandable, or when somebody explains that this concept or this way of teaching is so easily understandable, and you're like, I can't picture any of this, right? It's the easiest way, absolutely, to figure that like, oh, I must be different.
The amount of times, Colton, that I used to sit in class and I would be doing a math worksheet, or I would be doing some derivative of that, something I was completely couldn't have been less interested in if I tried, right? And don't get me wrong, there's many, many kids out there that don't like math. This is not a new phenomenon that we're touching on here.
Yeah.
But for me, I remember sitting there and looking around at all the people around me, and everybody had their head down and everyone was diligently working away. And I would just sit there and stare at this thing, and it may as well have been written in an archaic, ancient language.
Right.
And you kind of learn quickly, whether it's sitting in that classroom and looking around and seeing that everybody else is able to do what you're not able to do, whether it's continuously, being busy in your seat, or continuously wanting to get up and run around the room, or continuously interrupting an adult when they're talking because you already know what they're going to say, yet then you're interpreted as disrespectful. Then you have more attention of a teacher on you, kind of thing, right? And it really, like I said, it makes you feel like you stick out like this sore thumb all the time. And so for me, it was a lot of those experiences that I feel like it turned me into a bit of a searcher for something different, for something that I wasn't sure what it looked like. But I knew I was different, and I didn't understand what that meant. And it wasn't ever reinforced. And don't get me wrong, it was reinforced in a positive way by my parents, right? But outside of my family life, it was never reinforced in a positive way to me that being different was okay, that the fact that you might be struggling to do this, but hey, you're really good. You're a track and field champion. So guess what? It's not going to be that bad because there's other stuff you can do that's really good. You don't have to, your self-worth isn't based on this current math worksheet because there's so many other things you're good at. But one of the problems is, and this is where I get back to bolstering the strengths of young people, is the fact that, young people only have a few different ways to measure themselves. They're either good at school and adults like them, or they're not good at school and adults don't like them. And I'll give you a guess which one I was.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, it didn't fit that bill there. So, yeah, and I want to continue to move along this pathway, but earlier on you said something really interesting, is that you didn't have the traditional hallmarks of what people think somebody gets into gangs is like, right? You had a single family home. You didn't have anybody who was in gangs, which we look at that kind of through the eyes of like a traditional pathway of, what you see in the movies, what you see online all the time. But again, that non-traditional sense. And I'm curious, how here, especially, like how common is that non-traditional sense of like a similar upbringing to you for somebody to go into that kind of gang pathway?
Yeah, it's extremely common here. And I wouldn't, and don't get me wrong, right? In Vancouver and in the Lower Mainland especially, there are many kids that come from traditional risk backgrounds. And to be really honest with you, even someone like me, if you look deep enough into my history, whether it's with ADHD, things like that, there are traditional risk factors that are present in many of the lives of young people that get involved in gangs here. But realistically, one of the things that is absolutely true about the Lower Mainland, and it's a literal phenomenon, is the fact that young middle-class people get involved in gangs, right? That young middle-class people who have other opportunities still gravitate towards the gang lifestyle. And there's a few reasons for that. The first reason that I truly believe is the ease of access, the ease of entry into the drug trade, right? And you have to look no further, than the undercurrent that runs within the Lower Mainland, the undercurrent that runs through Vancouver. You go into any one of these cactus clubs in the Lower Mainland, and it's not to bash Cactus Club, right? But you go into any one of these higher end restaurants, and not so much in Vancouver due to the work of the Vancouver Police and Restaurant Watch and things like that. But you go into any one of these restaurants, and there's this undercurrent of these guys who are in there who are covered in tattoos, who are wearing watches that are worth $20,000+, who have $5,000-$10,000 in their pocket at any given time, and people see this. Right? And you can see this when you go out. And for me as a young person, one of the things that drew me into gang life was a literal complete accident. Because after high school, I had a bunch of negative experiences. And don't get me wrong, I had negative ones in high school as well. Right? But I had a bunch of negative experiences after high school, right? To be honest with you, I wanted to be a police officer, believe it or not. And I went to university after high school. was not good at that, right? Once again, the ADHD kind of kicked back in, and didn't have good study habits from my high school days, and ended up getting Fs and dropped out of university kind of thing. Then I want to want to get into the police, so I try to join the military, and I'm denied that because of my ADHD diagnosis.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I'm at the point, at 19 years old where I've just given up on myself. The world's just not made for me at this point,
Right.
quite frankly, and I'm sick of trying to be a square peg in a round hole, essentially. Yeah. And so I decided to go out and get a job at a restaurant. Not the stupidest thing anyone's ever done. Unfortunately for me, the restaurant bar that I got a job in was heavily frequented by guys involved in gangs, heavily frequented by guys involved in the drug trade. My first job was just as a cook in the kitchen, right? And I remember cooking in the kitchen, and I could see out through like what they call the pass bar, and I could see into the lounge. And that undercurrent that I just spoke about was in that lounge every single day, because there was this group of guys that would come in, and they were in there 5-6 times a week. They were all covered in tattoos. They all looked like they had nice jewelry. They all looked like they had money. They had attractive women with them. And everybody in that lounge kind of kept one eye on them. You know what I mean? It seemed like they got a lot of that attention. It seemed like people were afraid of them. At that age, I equated fear with respect, right? Not realizing the difference between the two. But just watching these guys and looking at their lifestyle and wondering, how did they become like that? Who are these guys? What do they do for a living? Why are they able to be here on a Wednesday at 2 p.m. having drinks when I'm at work, certainly, and everybody else is at work as well, right? And so it was through watching these guys, that was one of the things that drew me in, but I never thought anything of it. I thought, hey, I'm the guy in the kitchen. They're not going to care who I am, right? But it was through my second job at that restaurant that I got to know these guys, because when the kitchen was slow, I was a busboy. And I used to have to go out and bus tables, right? And so I would clear glasses and dishes off tables. And pretty soon, going up to these guys' tables became one of my favorite things, because next thing you know, they would ask me, hey, where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to high school, right? How come you're working here? And they would just get to know me. And it started off so innocently, and I was excited, because I went from being, when I would talk to these guys, I went from being the guy frying French fries in the kitchen for, I'd hate to give away my age by saying minimum wage was about $8.50 an hour at the time. Yeah. To all of a sudden, these guys are a bit interested in me. And you know what's funny is I never thought they'd want anything to do with me until they took an interest. And all of a sudden, I remember the moment that I bought in. And it was when I went and cleared, it was like 3-4 glasses off this guy's table. And he hands me a $100 bill as a tip. We talk about recruitment into gangs. No, there's no such thing as recruitment. But for me, it wasn't a recruiting process. They didn't ask me to fill out a job application. Right. They didn't care if I had my food safe. Right. Yeah. For me, it was that process of grooming. It was the utilization of that lifestyle to kind of hook me in, right? And it wasn't long before it became idle chit chat at the table to those big tips, to all of a sudden, sometimes I would work like a 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. shift. And, the restaurant would close at 1 a.m. And I'd get off and I'd be leaving, and they'd invite me to come sit with them. And all of a sudden I went from, again, being that guy in that kitchen to now all of a sudden I'm sat at that table with them. They're buying me dinner. They're buying me drinks. Then it becomes, hey, we're going to go out after. Why don't you come with us? Right? And then you show up at a club or a nightclub or a bar, and there's a lineup, that stretches a block. And these guys all walk up to the front of the line and, just handshake the bouncer some money, and I'll walk in. And every girl in that line sees these guys walk in. To me as a young, naive 19-year-old kid, that square peg that was always trying to fit into that round hole, I felt like I'd found my place.
Seems like these guys were making their own, making their
own rules, right?
Yeah.
Like they and you know what? It's exactly what you said. I was so done with trying to fit in where I didn't fit in. I was so done with trying to impress people that I felt like I would never be able to impress, right? That I had this need to like live by my own set of rules, to just be able to be somebody,
right?
And that was chiseled into me through all those experiences that we talked about, all the experiences in school, all the experiences of not, fitting in kind of thing, right? And it was a really powerful thing. And so we talk about that undercurrent in Vancouver, the accessibility of drugs with Vancouver being a port city, right? there's all these factors that are present within this city that can draw a young person into gangs. And I ultimately think, getting back to our point, is that's why you see young people here who have tons of other options yet still gravitate towards that gang lifestyle, because it seems like a shortcut. It seems like such a quicker way to get you to that finish line.
So many times I see even on my own social media feed, and just like these other, like, they don't brand it as a get rich quick scheme, but it's like invest in this, or like this Bitcoin or this, NFT token is going to take you to the next level if you start investing or create your own business there. And that's the easiest way. Just buy my course. Yeah. Right. That's it. Everybody is trying to sell you something. And it's interesting that, your story kind of starts at in that restaurant business for that, because, my wife was a previous server. And she'd always, the nights that she'd come back with the most amount of tips, she's like, that's when the gang guys were there. She's like, they were the nicest, because they would always tip the best. And again, that's a very easy way to, as you mentioned, start that grooming style of saying that here's what I have, here's what I can provide. And for somebody who is, again, looking for that shortcut, that's a great way to be like, wow, this is what we have to do. Or what do I need to do, rather, to get to that?
Well, and getting back to what you said, it's those, like, the people that are selling you the latest and greatest program, or the latest and greatest Bitcoin that's going to get you rich, right? We get back to those basic needs: food, shelter, right? Some identity, right? I'm going to have enough money where I can afford to live in this city, which is, for many people, already a massive stretch, doing it legitimately, kind of thing, right? So it's such a complex problem here. And it's a problem. I don't think there's a solution to gangs. Gangs have existed as long as human beings have congregated together, right? Like, I don't think there's necessarily, we're going to solve gangs, but it's like, how can we come up with as many meaningful strategies? How can we come up with as many meaningful hooks to pull a young version of me, someone who has all these different opportunities, who has means, whose parents had means, right? I'm almost embarrassed to say it sometimes. People brand me as like an ex-gang member. It's almost an embarrassing label for me, because I had no business being a gang member in the first place, right? But how can we create these, like, different hooks in somebody's life that can pull them away from that lifestyle? Because again, my needs aren't any different. I just meet them in a different way now, right? I do it through the work that I do. I do it through being good to people. I do it through being of service to people, as opposed to taking advantage of them. And the nicest part is at the end of the day, I've found a way to make a good living off of helping others. And for me, that meets my financial needs. It meets, the needs of my identity, who I am as a person. It allows me to reconcile myself, and I can look in the mirror, right? And really, that wasn't always the case. But so it gets back to looking at these basic needs, and what do people need, right? Everybody needs roughly the same thing. So how can we provide that to people?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, one of the things that we say in our trainings, and when we talk about, the idea is the pathway, right? Whether we're talking about the pathway to violence, the pathway to extortion, or of course the pathway to getting into gangs, right? Nobody wakes up one day and just decides, man, I'm going to go down and do all these things, right? Can't
wait to have a bad experience, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? Can't wait to just wake up and have the worst day ever. And I think the idea is that, when you also go back to those years and saying that I'm only thinking like 1 or 2 days ahead, right? Not understanding that it seemed like that there's a pretty tunnel vision aspect to that. Like, this is the only path for me. There's no other way. Like, this is what makes sense. But the work that you do, it sounds like you're just branching out those opportunities, like getting them to realize that there's so much more to you than just what you think you can do right now.
Yes. Yeah. And it's interesting because you touched on tunnel vision, which I think is a feature of being young, quite frankly, right? Yeah. It's an absolute feature of being young. Like, it's one of those situations where, if I could only go back with the knowledge I have now, right? But then, like, the catch-22 is you only get that knowledge through experience, right? So, but the interesting thing about that tunnel vision is, and linking it back to my own story and my own life, was I literally remember used to say, I'm either going to be a cop or a criminal.
Right.
And once that police door was closed to me kind of thing. It wasn't that I went out and chose to be a criminal.
Of course.
But it was the fact that because the only two career options I'd ever envisioned were police officer or potentially criminal, and I knew the criminal was going to be because the police officer part didn't work out. But it was that tunnel vision. It was the fact that, hey, I only have this one goal. And now that dream has been completely shattered, right? Now that I'm too dumb to get a 4-year university degree, and I had to drop out after getting multiple Fs after 2 semesters and felt like the dumbest person on earth. And my inner talk was just, you barely made it through high school. What are you doing here kind of thing? After doing that, and then, saying, hey, I'm going to try and join the military because guess what? I think I'm going to be better at shooting machine guns and throwing grenades than I would at school.
Yeah.
And then once that was denied to me and that police officer dream was dead, that tunnel vision led to hopelessness, and it led to an inability to see a future for myself. And when you don't value yourself, and when you don't see a future for yourself, and you don't have anybody in your life that's creating, we talked about that branch out, those extra tree branches, if you will. We want to get metaphorical here. If you don't have anybody in your life that's creating those, helping you realize at least that there's other options available to you, and you feel hopeless, lost, right? You are going to be at the mercy of whatever people or mentors or things come into your life. And unfortunately for me, when I had that tunnel vision that was lost, hopeless, my only life plan had been completely destroyed with all the experiences that I'd had, right? The next people that came into my life were guys in their 30s and their 40s who were murderers, who were gang members, and who needed a 19-year-old version of me to do all that dirty work for them, to do the stuff that they were too smart to do, to essentially be what I would describe as jail cover, quite frankly, right?
So you get that $100 bill, you're sold. They ask you to go to some clubs, some nightclubs, get a sense for that lifestyle. Like where do we go from there?
Well, that was the fun part.
Yeah, right.
It stopped becoming as fun after that. But, it's funny because it's a great question, and it's an important one because I remember the day upon reflection, of course. None of this is at the time.
Of course, yeah.
I've still got that 24-hour hamster brain mentality, right, at the time. But I remember the day that I, had bought in fully. And I remember the day that they knew that I had bought in because that was the day they said, it's time for you to quit the restaurant. Not, hey, do you want to quit the restaurant? Hey, what are your future plans? What do you think of this? No, it's time to quit the restaurant. We trust you now. We have other things for you to do. Right. And the very first thing that they had me do is they drove me out to a spot in the Fraser Valley, not going to say where, of course, right? They drove me out to a spot in the Fraser Valley, and they drove me by a house. And they said, hey, there's a marijuana grow operation inside that house, right? And the guy that owns that marijuana grow operation owes us some money. So what we want you to do is we're going to give you a gun, we're going to give you a mask, and we want you to go in that house. And we want you to basically secure everybody inside. And we're going to give you a phone. You're going to call the number that we give you, and then 2 other guys are going to come, and they're going to bag up and cut down all that marijuana, right? And so that was my first foray into what I describe as really serious criminality. I was terrified.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrified. And I remember I came back that night. I had a friend with me. And I remember standing outside that house because there was a glass patio door, and I figured the easiest way would be for us to just smash that glass patio door and go in and secure everybody inside, which I had no idea who was in there. There could have been a guy literally standing on the other end of that with a shotgun waiting for me, kind of thing. And I remember right before that I smashed that glass patio door and went in, I knew my life was never going to be the same. It was one of those weird moments where you almost pull back and you're in, it's just
step outside yourself.
Yeah, it's almost kind of cheesy to describe, but I had this weird third person moment where I was like, your life is never going to be the same after you do this. And then I smashed that glass patio door. I went in. Thank God there was only one guy inside. We secured him, called the number. Sure enough, these two other guys showed up. They cut down all that marijuana, and we all took off and went off without a hitch. Thank God. I mean, it certainly didn't have to. But it's kind of funny because, again, knowing that moment that I bought in, and for all of that trouble and all of that risk, I got $2,500.
Wow.
Yeah, right?
That's
wow. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, right.
Like basically one paycheck almost in a sense, you know? And it's hilarious because after that, I found out, being involved in the drug trade later and, setting up and running my own marijuana grow operations and understanding how the drug trade worked, et cetera, realizing that those guys made like $60,000+ off that evening. And I got 2,500 of it.
Yeah.
And then not only that, I find out later that the guy that owns that marijuana grow operation that quote unquote owes them money, they had fronted him the money to set up that marijuana grow operation. And so they knew when the plants were matured, they knew when it was going to come down, and they sent me in there to take it all, because then now not only do they get the money for that, they can turn around and say to him, well, you said you were going to pay us this money that we fronted you, so now you owe us. Right?
So all that
now you owe us with interest.
Yeah.
Right? Because they need to own you. That's what people don't understand. And that's what that I never understood getting in is when you get involved, these people need to own you, because if they own you, they can keep you working. If they own you, they can take advantage of you. Right? We talk about that recruitment. Like for me, it was a grooming process. It wasn't a recruitment process. It was them tactically utilizing aspects of their lifestyle, my lack of identity. Right? The sense of brotherhood that they, were consistently reinforcing, that they provided me, that I was part of something bigger than myself. Right? It was all of those things that were utilized against me. And so it started out with that one night and that one thing. Right? And then it slowly transitioned into, we have drug lines that we want you to work. Right? So working as a dial-it oper, right? Dial-it oping is pretty much the easiest thing on earth to understand. It functions the exact same as a pizza delivery service, only the pizza's heroin kind of thing.
Yeah.
I remember my first day doing that. I was given a phone. I was given a quantity of drugs. I was essentially told the phone's going to ring. You're going to answer it, and you're going to go and do a drug deal, whether it's crack cocaine, right, with whoever calls you up kind of thing. And you're just going to do that.
And you have this amount of, X amount of narcotics in your car, in your vehicle with you.
Oh, yeah. And not only that, believe me, terrifyingly looking over your shoulder constantly for the police, who are, as much as I used to think they're stupid, they're not quite so dumb. They're not quite as dumb as I thought previously, who are trained and out there looking for this, right? Literally having a police officer stop you and you have crack cocaine down the front of your pants, and there's a cop at either window with these massive flashlights, and you know exactly where you're going if they find those drugs, right? So being terrified of law enforcement, but over and above that, being terrified of being robbed, being terrified of potentially losing all of those drugs kind of thing that you have, because I was only doing it for the first few months before I was robbed for the first time. A guy had called me up, had said, hey, I want this, this, and this. I'm going to go meet him. And one of the things about that job, if you can call it a job, is you're always busy. You're always rushing, right? There's a lot of people that love drugs, especially in the Lower Mainland. There's no shortage of that, right? It's a supply and demand issue, quite frankly. But you're always rushing. You're always busy. And so because you're always busy and you're always behind, it causes you to rushing makes you disregard certain cues and certain things that if you were slowing down, you would see, right? Yeah. It makes you disregard not looking for police as diligently as you would normally. It makes you disregard the people that are getting in and out of your vehicle, because when this guy jumped in my vehicle, it was like a hotter day. And if I was slowing down a little bit, I would have realized, hey, why is this guy wearing like a massive winter coat on a hot day? And then as I'm reaching down to, get him his stuff, and I just wanted him out of the car so I could get on my way kind of thing, right? Just hurry up and get out. Here's your stuff. Give me the money. Get the heck out of here kind of thing, right? He then reaches up his sleeve and he pulls a needle out of his arm. And he holds it to my neck because he wants my drugs and my money. And believe me when I say I gave them to him. Yeah. And two things happened after that. I spent the next probably half an hour to an hour frantically looking at my neck, because in those types of situations, God forbid, you're ever in one, but in those types of situations, your adrenaline pumps so hard that it almost seems like a dream.
Right.
It seems like a kind of a dreamy memory almost after it happens.
Yeah.
Like time almost does this weird thing where it speeds up and slows down at the same time, if that makes any sense. And so I couldn't remember if he had touched me. I saw it was a needle, but I wasn't 100%. I didn't feel a poke or anything, but I just remember I couldn't get it out of my mind that he might have touched me with that needle, right?
I'll be for marks or anything.
Looking for marks, checking my neck, right? And I'll be generous in my description of this gentleman. He wasn't a clean-looking gentleman, for lack of a better word, right? And something that may have recently been in his arm was at my neck, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I actually had to go. Like I actually went. I was so paranoid about this. I didn't see any marks, but I was so paranoid about this. I went and got a blood test because I was so terrified. I couldn't sleep over this because I was wondering, like, is this something that? And frankly, like, thankfully the blood test came back negative and nothing ended up happening. And it can be a great story that I tell on a podcast now. But just imagine how inalterably my life could have been changed from that moment because it's something that I was out doing at 20 years old.
Yeah.
Right. So it's this weird transition that, like, it starts out really slow and then it almost kicks into overdrive. It starts out with, like I said, going and robbing that grow up for these guys, and then transitions into, next thing you know, this is your daily life, whether it's dial-it-oping, whether it's moving drugs throughout the city, whether it's violence and intimidation, whether it's drug debt collections, right? It just becomes your daily life. And you know what the wild part is we talked about disregarding personal safety, and you almost, while you're doing it, you forget it's illegal.
Right.
In this insane turn of events, because it's just your day-to-day life.
There's so much acceptance in that community of this is just what our life is.
Well, and it's interesting too, because not only you talk about acceptance into that community, people drop out of your life pretty quick, right? Because they're smart. They see the writing on the wall. Like a lot of people were just kind of like, hey, and they never said anything, don't get me wrong, right?
Yeah.
They just kind of stop returning your calls and you go your separate ways, right? But it's a world that totally pulls you in, and everybody around you that you associate with is involved, at least in some form of criminality, whether they're, a drug dealer, whether they're, somebody who does credit cards. Everybody's doing something illegal to a point, and it becomes like this alternate lifestyle. And you have this mentality, and it's so funny now because it's the opposite for me now. You have this mentality where you laugh at all the regular people. Oh, look at you getting up at 8 a.m. and going to work. Well, I don't go to bed till 8 a.m.
Right. Yeah.
And it pulls you into this completely different lifestyle because you're up half the night, whether you're partying, whether you're just paranoid kind of thing, staying up all night, right? And sleeping half the day and only living to be in that bar, being in that restaurant, right? Spending the day trafficking drugs, right? Whether it's connecting two people, that one that has drugs, one that needs drugs, tacking on a percentage per pack for yourself kind of thing, making money that way. Distributing your own drugs via your own lines. At the time, for me, it was marijuana grow operations. It was hugely profitable. It was still obviously very illegal at the time, and it was quite a hot button commodity within Vancouver. The marijuana market was thriving, and it becomes this endless pursuit of money, of pleasure, but ultimately, day to day, it seems like an endless pursuit of money and pleasure. But looking back, it's a numbing that takes place.
Right.
It's the wanting to numb yourself, because in the back of your mind, your life's not going well. I wasn't an idiot kind of thing. I may have put on a good front that this is the life I wanted and I was happy and this is so great. But ultimately, deep down, I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew what I was doing wasn't sustainable, right? So it was a consistent numbing, and a consistent almost redirection of my thoughts, because anytime I looked inside, it got too scary.
Right. So
So it's just like whatever I can do to numb myself, whatever I can do to have fun, to feel good, right? Because every time I'm still and every time things are slow, I think about the kid that I used to be. And I think about the fact that my parents sit up worrying about me constantly. My mom not being able to sleep because she's worried that I'm going to get killed.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And that was actually going to be my next question. It's like you're kind of in the mix. You're in the middle of it right now, but you did come from that, again, single family home. You had parents who were in the picture, knew about you. Did they start to see some of those signs? What were some of those signs as well, maybe for other parents who might be listening to, see what that pathway might look like earlier on?
Yeah, well, in terms of signs for parents to look for, right? The number one sign that you're going to want to look for, especially if a kid is getting involved in the actual drug trade, is unexplained amounts of money, right? At the end of the day, people rarely have cash on them. So certainly children shouldn't have $1,000 kind of thing, right? Yeah. So things like having unexplained amounts of money, having multiple cell phones, right? Leaving the house for oddly short and then sometimes longer trips, right? Like there's all these kind of telltale signs of what to look for when a young person is at home, right? And you're going to pick up things. You're going to pick up new friends maybe, right? So really knowing who your kids' friends are, knowing what your kids' peer group consists of, right? But for me and my parents, it was just the realization continuously that they knew what was happening. And my parents always said, "We love you so much. Why are you doing this? Like, why can't you change? Why don't you change?" And it was interesting because my parents continuously supported me through this. And it's funny because some people would look back and say, well, why didn't you just cut them off and let them hit rock bottom or whatever that looks like, right? We have this mentality and sometimes in society where I think, oh, everyone needs to hit their rock bottom and then they'll figure it out. Well, I've hit rock bottom before, and I can tell you, I took a jackhammer to that rock bottom and made a different one.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so it was like, if you're just going to let somebody continuously flounder, you're going to lose them, right? And so my parents did their best to try and say, hey, what are you doing? Like, we can help you, like all this stuff, right? Really basically anything they could. But I was my own person and I was going to make my own decisions. But the realization that when I got out of jail, my parents had always continuously said, we don't like what you're doing, but we love you and we'll always be there for you. You know? And that's what ultimately drew me back and brought me back, was the connection to my family, was the love of my parents, was the fact that when I finally had enough, and I'm a slow learner. I am a slow learner upon reflection. Right. Because it took me a long time and a lot of really bad experiences to finally had enough. But when I'd hit my triple rock bottom, I guess we'd call it at this point. Yeah. When I hit that rock bottom at this point, when I came out of jail, my parents said, hey, we love you, right? You want to do something different? Of course we're going to let you come live with us. Of course we're going to help you rebuild your life. And it's not a fairy tale in the way I'm making it sound, right? It could be 3 podcasts. Yeah. Just that process in and of itself. Totally. But it was their unconditional love for me. And it was their unconditional acceptance of me. That's what brought me back. And I think that's what parents need to realize. It's not okay if your kid's joining a gang. It's not okay if your kid's getting involved in drugs. And it doesn't mean that you have to be supportive of their behavior, but you have to be supportive of them. You have to love them. You have to want them to come back, right? Yeah. And you have to give them something to come back to. One of the greatest gifts my parents ever gave me was my childhood, because it gave me this humanity that I saw a lot of other people in that lifestyle. They didn't have that because they grew up in juvenile detention facilities, because they have massive adverse childhood experience ACEs scores, right? Because they have all these really negative things that happen to them. They don't have that basic sense of empathy. They weren't able to develop it because, we only know what we know. And if empathy has never been shown to you and kindness has never been shown to you, how would you know how to show it to anybody else? Yeah. And so it was really the realization that my parents gave me that greatest gift of all, and that was my childhood, because I was still that kid inside. There was still that kid inside that knew right from wrong, that had a conscience, that would nip at me every once in a while when I was sober, when I was not... when you have that kind of when I was not hedonistic, when I had that moment of still self-reflection that I absolutely hated, don't get me wrong at the time, but there was still me in there. And that's what my parents gave me. And that's what my parents, I think, saw and continued to nurture, was the fact that, this is not our kid. He has turned into this person as a young adult, but this is not who he is at his core. And it was that acceptance that brought me back. And it was why family was so unbelievably important, because family for me provided an anchor. It provided connection. It provided like that secure attachment for me to be able to come back, for me to be able to reevaluate my life, for me to be able to change, right? And realistically, even just the economics behind it, the fact that I was able to go back and live with my parents after prison was massive. I wasn't struggling to pay rent. I wasn't struggling to have to find a job immediately. I was able to take a second. I was able to slowly detach from that lifestyle, which takes a significant amount of finesse as well, right? Like I was able to pull myself back from that in a meaningful way. And it was because they provided that secure base for me.
Yeah. So you mentioned really it's that unconditional acceptance of you. And going back to where that kind of grooming style was happening, you started to find a different version of that acceptance. So, you know, the kinship, the brothership, you know, the brotherhood, the us versus them kind of mentality.
Yeah.
So you're right in the mix, right? So we're right in the mix of this happening. Did you feel that you had that type of acceptance that you were kind of yearning for or looking for at that time?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I completely felt I had that acceptance. That belief was eroded over time because it's a house built on sand, right? That belief was eroded over time, but absolutely, I felt I had that acceptance. And I think one of the big drivers for feeling I had that acceptance for me was the fact that these guys were significantly older than me. I feel like as a young men tend to look up to older men as mentors, as you know, guides, right? And for me, it was more, hey, I finally found somebody who not only accepts me, but then is going to provide me with a vehicle to live the rest of my life the way I wanted to. Like, it's so funny because I look back at this and I just think, like, I remember feeling lucky, right. As crazy as that sounds, feeling lucky that these guys wanted to have me around, feeling lucky that these guys were willing to give me these opportunities, because the alternative was not attractive. The alternative was, again, I have no idea what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. I have no idea how I'm going to make a living for myself, right? And yet these guys provided me that. And they were really good at fostering that us against them mentality, that working stiff's an idiot kind of deal, right? When it's hilarious because, you know, you look back and it's like us having to rent a hotel room, and it's like, you know, half these guys don't even have a credit card because they don't have a bank account, or they don't have credit, or they have all this, you know, it's like this weird mirage that they put up, and they use that mirage, which is the lifestyles, that mirage, you know, not telling you the fact that, they got $3,000 or $4,000 on them, but some of these guys, that $3,000 or $4,000 is pretty much all they have to their name, kind of thing, right? Or it's all the money they made today, and they might make that again tomorrow, but it's not like, you're not building anything, and it's nothing that's sustainable. You live your entire life with a piano dangling above your head by a string, and the string just continuously breaks a little bit more every single day, right? But I didn't see that when I was a kid, and I was a searcher. I was looking for something. And I didn't feel like I would be able to find it. And so when I felt like I was lost at sea, those guys, I felt like, threw me a life preserver, and they gave me a different way of life, and I loved them. I respected them. You know what I mean? There are still guys that I'm really, really looking back, I'm really fond of. Most of them are passed away now, and I make it a really big point to not associate with anybody in that world anymore, because I really truly believe there's no such thing as a halfway crook kind of deal, right? Like you don't want to be even associated, associated with those people. And it's interesting too, because I'm older now, and most of the guys that I was involved with have passed away. Most of the guys that I was involved with have gone off to jail. Like it's a short lifespan in that world, right? So, and it's one of the reasons that I don't have to look over my shoulder. I don't stress about the past or stress about this or that, right? It's because that lifestyle, it chews you up and spits you out. There's two types of people, right? There's the people like me who kind of figured it out, who either went on to do something else, who were able to get away from it, who were able to get out. And then there's the people who never figured it out, the people that end up in jail or dead, because ultimately those are your two destinations for this lifestyle. It's jail or death. It's really all it is.
And that turnover rate is pretty high.
The turnover rate's high, and it's interesting because I would say, and I don't want to sound doom and gloom about this, because I'm a preventionist and an interventionist at heart. I don't want to talk myself out of a job here, but It's getting worse in a sense that the kids are getting younger. It's getting worse in a sense that the kids are buying in for less. You know what I mean? Like it's sad to see how young people, how many shortcuts some young people are willing to take because they don't have those other branches. They don't see a quick path to success. And one of the things that I was blessed, in my opinion, to not grow up with was social media. Right? So now it's like you talk about, searching for things, searching for who you are, your identity, searching for how to make a living for yourself, right? So now I was contending with that, but I was contending with that on a micro level. That was a struggle that was going on in my head. And, I was influenced by pop culture and television and things like that, of course, right? But I can't imagine what my needs would have been if I would have had Instagram.
Right.
Or if I would have had TikTok or any one of those things.
That.
I was already a materialistic little prick, for lack of a better word. I can't imagine how bad I would have been if my entire socials feed was everybody's on vacation all the time. Everybody's got millions of dollars in the snap. Sell me the next program, as you said earlier, right? Look at my yacht. You can have a bigger yacht than this kind of thing. And this is just bombarded. And it's in the palm of my hand 24/7. I would have been almost a lost cause, I'm afraid to say.
That algorithm gets you for sure. So, and that's good to know that. I mean, obviously there's a difference between the acceptance of like that true unconditional like family love and acceptance, because I think one of the things you said earlier is that these guys do whatever they can to own you, right? This brotherhood, this kinship that we have, it's there until it's not.
Well, and what you said there is too is that unconditional acceptance of my family, because what parent, when their child is getting involved in the drug trade, when their child becomes a violent drug debt collector, when their child is sent off to the penitentiary, to prison, to jail kind of thing, whatever you want to call it, depending on how much time you do, what parent doesn't have that thought? I just want to give up on this kid. It's a natural human thing to do, because it's a response of them hurting, right? It's a response of them hurting. But what makes that connection, the genuine connection, versus that house built on sand, that mirage, that acceptance, quote unquote, that those guys provided me, that was extremely conditional. That acceptance was extremely based on me doing exactly what they wanted me to. That protection, that brotherhood was based on me following a very specific set of protocols to the letter, right? Whereas that was very conditional. My parents' love, my parents' acceptance was unconditional, because who in God's name wouldn't want to give up on me at that age, quite frankly? Yeah.
So you mentioned jail, penitentiary a couple times. Are you open to talk about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. Yeah.
So, I mean, you're in the middle. Again, we're back in the mix. We're day to day. This is your lifestyle.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the jail time. What happens there?
Yeah, I mean, jail's a really interesting experience. So I was sentenced to, ultimately my destination ended with me being sentenced to a year in prison for firearms offenses. And I was on community corrections. I had a 10-month community corrections order, and then was caught with a firearm while I was on a community corrections order. So they were not happy, to say the least. I wasn't exactly abiding by my restrictions. So I ended up getting the year in prison for the loaded firearm eventually. And I remember my first day walking into North Fraser pretrial, and it's like, it's this weird, different world. It's like getting pushed off the deck into the deep end of the water. And that door shuts behind you, and it's so loud. It's so loud. It's just, everything's metal and heavy. And everything smells like a mix of bleach and vomit. And there's guys that are dope sick on the floor. You come in off the street into pretrial, right? And it's basically when the judge says, you're not going home. You're remanded into custody, or we're going to put you, you're serving a prison sentence kind of thing. So you're going to start do a couple of days in remand and be transferred on to your facility where you're doing your sentence. But I remember that first day in the holding tank when you first get in there, and it's disgusting. There's people that are dope sick. There's people that are crying, right? And everyone just has this weird cold look on their face. It's like this, there's such an absence of humanity in there. It's shocking to me. And it's violent, right? There's fights, there's people get stabbed, people get hot buttered, right? Like there's bad stuff happens in there. It's prison at the end of the day. But I'd seen some movies. I was kind of expecting the violent aspect of stuff. But the thing that struck me the most was just the utter ever present sadness of the place. Just this hollow, empty, devoid of emotion sadness is what really shocked me about it. And it kind of just sucks the life out of you almost when you're in there, especially those first few days. I didn't realize this at the time because I didn't know anything about the human body or the nervous system, but I was completely stuck in nervous system dysregulation. I didn't eat for the first few days I was there. And not because I was afraid to eat or was denied food or anything, but just because I physically wasn't hungry because my body is stuck in this like
hyper arousal,
anxious, like, okay, like who's around me constantly kind of thing. Right. Yeah. And it's funny because looking back, like that was the reality of the first, few days to a week in there. But that stuff does stick with you. That's kind of the sad reality of it, is that hypervigilance. And whether it's the lifestyle that I was involved in or my time in jail, it puts you in this state of hypervigilance, and it almost rewires you to constantly like be ready to jump at a second, to constantly be on edge. But walking onto the range the first day, I didn't know what it would look like. But when I got on there, it was so loud. There's like maybe 30 to 35 cells on each range. But they're double bunked. So there's like 75 guys on every unit. So you walk in there, you come in through the door and there's a guard sitting at a desk and he basically tells you which cell to go in, and everybody's just watching you. Right. And you learn pretty quickly that there is a ton of rules in there that they don't tell you about. You learn pretty quickly that the guards don't run the jail. The inmates run the jail, right? The guards are there to make sure you don't leave. Yeah. And if the guards decide they want to run the jail for a little bit, they'll crack down on everybody and they'll make everybody's life miserable. But part and parcel, the inmates run those institutions in a lot of ways. And they do it by a specific code that's expected of everybody, right? No stealing, but stuff is simple as like, I remember one time a guy in there, it was like 8 a.m, and there's always a table on every range that kind of controls the range. These are like what they call the heavies. These are the guys that kind of control things in there. And I remember one guy, he just dragged his chair, like, you're pulling a chair, and he dragged his chair across the floor. Well, it woke one of the guys up, I guess, at like, it's like 7:45 in the morning. And then Buddy gets like severely assaulted over that. Wow. And they wait until he's in his cell, and then 3 guys go in and just lay the boots to him kind of thing, and then they're out and gone. And it was over dragging his chair across the floor. So I learned to acclimate myself to that world pretty quickly, and I learned how to get in good with certain people, and I watched my back very diligently, because one of the things I was always worried about, whether it's being transferred through sheriff's custody, whether it's going through court custody, whether it's ending up, in pretrial and then being transferred to your, the institution where you're serving your time. One of the only things that all criminals have in common is jail. So you're going to run into people there. You're going to run into that guy you fucked over last year. Yeah. You're going to run into that guy that you robbed. And I was lucky because I wasn't really a jacker. I didn't really kind of do business like that in a sense, but you're always, there are people, you have enemies. And not only did I have enemies at the time, my friends' enemies were also by default my own enemies as well. Right. Yeah. So you're always looking over your shoulder, right? You're always wondering who's going to walk in that door that may not like me, or maybe I don't like them. And you're always being on guard, because if anybody tests you in there, you have to take care of it. Because if you don't, then people are going to think, wow, that guy's an easy target. Yeah. Something as simple as, and this always, like, people always laugh when I tell them this, but if you call someone a goof in there, that's fighting words. Yeah. Like if someone calls you a goof, you literally have to fight them on the spot.
You have to be prepared for.
Yeah, that's the only answer to being called a goof. Yeah, is like fists on the spot kind of thing, right? So it's this weird world, and it's funny because going back to like us talking about this mentality of like the us versus them mentality, I swear this jail code, there's like a jail mentality that people almost have, and they do it as like this form of like, it's another basic need that they're meeting. It's this, well, I'm good in jail. I'm not a PC. I'm not a rat. I'm not a goof. My reputation in jail is good. Like, you know, whatever you want to describe that as. And it's almost another form of acceptance that they're feeling because of that. It's an acceptance into a subculture, right? Because ultimately, like, if you don't fit into the dominant culture, and I don't care whether this is any dominant culture on earth, if you don't fit into the dominant culture, you're feeling that square peg in that round hole kind of thing. You're going to seek out a subculture that provides you some acceptance, that like, you know, kind of affirms your way of living, right? And for a lot of people, it's jail. For a lot of people, it's gangs. For a lot of people, it's prison. So there's this strange subculture that exists in there, and there are guys who it's sad to see. And I was only in provincial custody because I was sentenced to less than 2 years. But there's guys in there. It's sad to see that they're just in and out of that place constantly. Like, I would have guys who I'd run into and they'd go, "Oh, you're back again, eh?" And I'd go, "No, I'm still here." Yeah. What do you mean? Yeah. What do you mean I'm back again? Like, didn't you get out last week? Like, how are you possibly back here, kind of thing, right? But it's literally a revolving door for some people. But yeah, it's a really violent place. It's a really lonely place. One of the things that was really, really hard was the fact that when you're in jail, your life stops. Your life goes on pause, and everybody else's life continues on to some degree. And you find out who the people that care about you are. And that was one of the things that made me realize is the guys who I thought were my brothers, who I thought were my friends, who had, you know, who loved me and all this stuff. Like, when I wasn't useful to them anymore because I was in jail, when I wasn't making money for them anymore, when my drug business had collapsed, they were very quick to move on. They were very quick to, you know, I would call them on a Friday night, and I can almost picture where they are because normally I'd be with them. And, you know, for the first while, they'll answer, "Oh, how's it going? You know, how's jail, whatever." And then, sure enough, over time, those phone calls start to go unanswered a little bit more, and it's harder to get a hold of them, right? But it's like, the hardest thing was seeing that for me, but also it was the best thing that happened to me. But another difficult thing as well was seeing my parents having to come visit me there, right? Having your family have to drive out into the middle of the country to come and see in prison, see in jail kind of thing. It's just one of those things where it's like, you'll find out who your friends are if you go to jail. And it's the people that answer your calls. It's the people that will put money on your inmate account. It's the people that will return your letters, even, because like mail day is like the greatest day ever kind of thing, right? So it's a really lonely place. It's a really scary place, but it's also a place of reflection if you allow it to be. I truly believe that jail was the best thing that ever happened to me, because we talked about this before. I'm a slow learner. And I needed that experience. I needed that time. I needed to realize, hey, I'm 20. I had my 24th birthday in jail, quite frankly, like literally in jail for my birthday. And it's like, where are all my mountains of money? Where are all my riches, right? Where's all that peace? And, you know, my beautiful wife and my mansion? Where are all these things, quite frankly? Because the guy next to me won't stop throwing up. You know what I mean? It's a place of self-reflection if you allow it to be, right? And it's sad to see, because I remember getting released from jail. It's kind of like Christmas morning, but like on steroids. It's like the greatest day ever. And it's weird because they keep you there for so long, and then one day they're like, "Yeah, you can go." And it's this massively jarring experience to go from being in custody to all of a sudden
you just have to adapt to a brand new life.
You just leave one day though, right? And it's funny because, you know, when you get released, they call you down to this area called records interception. And you go into records interception, and because I was in provincial, they make you wear uniforms in there. So they gave me my property back. It was my street clothes, basically, that I'd gone in there with. And so they put you in your street clothes. You're ready to leave, and everybody you're in one they call holders, so they call them a tank, right? So you're in one last tank, and the door's about to pop, and you just walk out into the parking lot. You get to go home. And it's so funny because there was maybe 8 or 9 other guys that I was in there with that got released that day. And it was interesting to hear the conversation that day, because you talk about Christmas morning on steroids. Every single person in that room said, "You know what? I'm going to be different. I'm not going to do dope anymore. I want to be there for my kids." Right? But I truly believe that the difference between me and a lot of those guys, and I know some of them went back, because they give you like a 1-day transit pass that gets you anywhere you want in the Lower Mainland. But that's pretty much the only support they give you when you leave.
Right.
It might be a little bit different now. To be honest with you, I'm not sure. I was released from prison a few years ago, but they give you a 1-day transit pass that gets you anywhere you want in the Lower Mainland. And so walking out of that prison, I watched all those guys go and walk to that bus stop, and I know some of them went back.
Right.
But the difference with me was my parents and my best friend came and picked me up. Right. So.
And right there, that's the
difference.
Yeah.
So how do we expect people to go from a cycle that they're caught in? How are they going to break that cycle meaningfully? Right? When they're given a 1-day transit pass and very minimal to no support on their way out type of thing.
Yeah. It seems like it's a very an easy way to get back to just where you were released from.
Yeah, it's a really intense, and that's exactly it, right? And for many of these guys, especially in provincial custody, it's just a one-way ticket back to the downtown east side, or back to like that the neighborhood that they thrive in terms of the drug community, because
that's all they know.
That's all they know, and addiction is rampant within jail. I truly believe that one of the big things with me that was a huge protective factor was I've struggled with alcohol and I've struggled with drugs previously, but I was never caught in like that cycle of perpetual addiction. I was never, addicted to opioids or anything like that. So I think that just adds a whole other layer to it. And it makes it so it's just like your brain just gets wired for drugs, right? And so they just go back and it's just that cycle starts again, and it goes back to like those guys I would see who they'd get out and they'd be back a week later, and it's just because they'd get out and they'd go on like a 5-day no sleep meth binge and get arrested, and then they're back again, right? And then the cycle starts all over again. It's actually really sad to see.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's fair to say that in that time, you definitely had your kind of come to Jesus moment, that you want to be out of that lifestyle.
Yeah.
But to what you're doing now, I feel like that has its own process as well as, wanting to become this, because so you're back at home, you decide, I don't want to be in this lifestyle anymore, but there's no job. You're like, again, you have a place to stay.
Yeah.
You've got that time to kind of reflect and go through there. And, what made you decide that you want to go into that kind of education?
Yeah. This is interesting as well, because it's like, I truly believe in life, there's no silver bullet moment for anything. I get asked a lot, like, when was your one moment you decided to leave gangs? There's no one moment. There's a collection of experiences that make it up. And to be honest with you, for me, it was struggling to find a job. And I think it's important that we touch on this, because it goes back to the cyclical nature of incarceration, of the cycle of crime, the cycle of offending, was the fact that, how hard it is to find a job with a criminal record.
Right.
And I filled out so many job applications. And there's always this question that they ask. And it's always on page 2 for some reason. I never understood that. Just
you got to go
make
through
it the
one
first
page of
work. I know,
yeah.
right? Yeah, make it the first one. It was always on page 2, and it always says, have you ever been convicted of a crime for which you haven't received a record suspension? Check yes or no. And you got to check yes, because they're going to check anyways, right? I filled out so many of those job applications. I never got a single call back. That by the time I was on the last few going in, and I would just flip to look for that question. And if it was on there, I would just leave. Like, it wasn't even worth the ink and the pen to fill it out, because like, they have 50 people applying for that job, and 49 of them don't have a criminal record. Guess what? You're out of luck, right? I got really lucky. Through a friend, I actually got hired at a heavy-duty mechanic shop as like a truck and trailer shop, just as a shop helper. It paid okay, right? It paid okay. I was living with my parents at the time. But the cool part about this place that I got hired, it was kind of like it's a company called Ocean Trailer. It was kind of like there was a family vibe to it. And I remember my parole officer had to come visit my job. And I thought, well, there goes this job. Like, that was a fun one for 2 weeks, right? But it's hilarious, because when I went and told my supervisor and word got to the upper management that, my parole officer has to come visit the job, the owner comes and sees me. And he says, hey, I heard that this parole officer has to come visit. Would you be okay with me meeting them? And I said, yeah, like, like, do I still work here? Like, that's
Yeah.
a miracle, right? And he goes, yeah, you still work here. And he goes, because you're a great employee, because you show up on time, because you do a good job, right? And it becomes like this launching pad for me. And it's interesting because he says, why don't you start working towards being a commercial transport mechanic? Why don't we get you on the tools? Why don't we get you like moving towards this goal? And to be honest with you, I was like, I can do that. Like, I thought,
Right.
you know what I mean? Like, I was so used to being to taking L's, quite frankly, that I couldn't even believe that it was possible for me to do anything. I was so friggin' down on myself and had such a bad self-image at the time that I couldn't believe it was possible for me to do anything. And it was through that process that I started to, you know, work there, and I started to make some decent money. But then I broke my ankle about a year and a half into that job. And I was on crutches for like 8 weeks. It was terrible. Oh, it was terrible. I was watching like Pawn Stars.
Yeah,
and,
right.
oh, it was just awful, right? Like a foot break is the worst because getting
You're
up is just terrible,
done.
right? Yeah, you're on crutches all the time.
Yeah.
You're never expending any energy, so you're going to bed at like 4 in the morning. I was kind of back to my old schedule.
Right.
You're sleeping till 3 in the afternoon kind of thing. And I remember, you know, the job was good and the company was great and I liked the people, but I remember thinking, man, this job's pretty hard on people. Like a lot of the guys that I saw that were the older guys were drinking a lot, and they were drinking a lot because of the injuries that they'd sustained in the job. Their bodies were hurting, their backs were tired and hurting all the time. Like, and I kind of felt it in me as well. Like I would go home and I would take a shower, and it's kind of gross, but I would take a shower and I would like blow my nose and wash my nose, and it would just come out black.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
you're just breathing in
All the grease and
not
dust
good
and all
stuff.
that,
Yeah, dust and brake pad, asbestos, and just all kind. It's an honorable profession, an honorable trade, certainly, but it's not an easy one, and it's not a clean one. I can promise you that. Like my nails were just constantly black, kind of thing. And so it always kind of bugged me. When I was off that 8 weeks with no pay because I hurt my ankle actually outside of work, so I was on just medical EI at the time, and I was thinking like, hey, imagine my body just completely gives out on me at some point, or imagine my back's so bad at 50 that I can't do this anymore. Like, I'm making a living off my body, like, you know, and I was about 26 at the time. And I remember thinking like, it always bothered me that I dropped out of university. It always kind of bothered me, I think, in the back of my head that I didn't think I was ever smart enough to do a degree kind of thing. Right. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to go back to university. And I went and told my parents, and I told some other people, and everybody but my parents laughed. And even my parents kind of laughed because they're like, okay, Jordan, you're going to go to university. This should be interesting, right? And so sure enough, I signed up for university, and I go back and I take Psych 1100 and 1200 my first 2 semesters back. And instead of getting all Fs, I got an A+ and an A. And I really believe that, like, me getting that job at that company, me, you know, breaking my, like, it was all part of this cosmic sequence of events that upon reflection led me towards that education. And I feel like my education and being able to finally achieve something, especially something that I always thought I inherently believed forever that I was stupid. Like if you'd asked me, I'd have been like, no, I'm school dumb. You know what I mean? Like, school's not an option for me. And then I go back to school and I start getting A's and A+ and start, you know, really blowing these courses away type of thing. And that became almost like the mechanism for rebuilding my self-esteem, for rebuilding my identity, because finally it was like, hey, I'm good at school. Like I'm this, I'm that, right? Like I have these cornerstones to hang my identity off now, right? I'm not just like that square peg in that round hole anymore. I'm doing really, really well. And it was interesting because I started to pursue my criminology and psychology degree. And I remember being interested in research, being interested in, you know, crime desistance, things like that. But I used to think, like, what the hell am I taking a criminology degree for? I have a horrible criminal record. Like, what am I going to do with this thing? But I just remember doing it and thinking, you know what, I'll just get a bachelor's. Because when you're young and in school, you think the minute you have a bachelor's, there's this pile of money at the end of the rainbow kind of thing. You might, you know, you can probably identify with that, where you think you get this bachelor's degree and you're on easy street.
That's it. Yeah, no problem.
That's it. It's perfect now, right? Like, there's my mansion right over there. And I had that mentality. So I thought, you know what, just push through and get this bachelor's degree, and, you know, you're passionate about it, whatever, you like it. And it was interesting because I think one of the reasons I was finally good at school wasn't to do with the fact that I, had grew a bunch of brain cells. If anything, I got tons of them knocked out of my head. It was more to do with the fact that I didn't have to sit with that math sheet in front of me anymore because I was doing something I was interested in. And because I was engaged and interested, I was head and shoulders above many of my peers in those classes. And I remember I used to hang out outside the psychology lab, and I was too nervous to go in. And I felt like a bit of a freak because I had all these tattoos and stuff. And back at this time, this is like, 10-ish years ago, like tattoos weren't as common kind of thing, right? And I'm sitting in entry-level classes, and I'm this like 27-year-old dude with all these tattoos, and these like 18-year-old kids are like, who the heck is this guy, right? And you can always tell the mature student that returns after some life experience, because I had my hand up all the time. I'm sitting in the front providing all this comment, asking questions, while everybody's just like, oh, shut up, we just want to get out of here, right? But I'd hang out outside the psychology lab, and I remember there was an ad. It was more of an announcement, I guess, that Kwantlen had received some SHRC funding, so Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. They'd received $1 million to study, and it was a strength-based approach, study the gang problem within the Lower Mainland. So the principal investigator's name, Dr. Girbat, was on there. And so I just emailed her because, again, I was too nervous to go into psychology. Right. So I just emailed her, and I didn't even know what I was doing, quite frankly. I just said, hey, this is who I am. I'm interested in this research, and I'm wondering if you would just tell me a little bit about it. And this is my past. Like, I've had some personal experience with gangs, things like that, right? And it's funny because I wasn't even expecting a response. And I send this email, and like an hour later, she's like, are you available to meet this week?
Wow.
Right? And so we meet for coffee, and she's such a wonderful person. She elicited my story out of me almost right away because she's such a warm person. She's somebody you just want to open up to. And she goes, this is incredible. And I said, I couldn't understand what she meant. And she's like, don't you get it? Like, the fact that you went through all this and you're here and trying to get your degree, that's amazing. And I was like, don't you just think I'm a loser? Like, what? You can't even, you don't believe it until, even when someone tells you, you don't believe it, right? So she hired me on as a research assistant. And so I started to work as a research assistant, and I was doing both. I was still working at the heavy duty mechanic shop during the day, 8:30 to 5:30, and then 7 to 10, 3 nights a week. I was going to school, right? So it was a grind, man. It was an absolute grind. And so I went to my boss at the heavy duty mechanic shop, and I said, hey, I have this opportunity to work as a research assistant. What would you think of me only working 4 days a week instead of 5? Most employers would be like, no, no, it's not happening, right? He goes, of course. That sounds so exciting. Yeah. Right? And so I start working as a research assistant, and then through that work, I meet Staff Sergeant Lindsay Houghton of the Combined Forces Special Enforcement Unit. And because they were partners with that program at the time, the Acting Together Cure Project, and he sits down and he says, do you understand what you have here? Like, just in your life story kind of thing, just in your life story in terms of how valuable these experiences could be for other people. And I always thought at the time my past was going to be something I should probably try and either hide or downplay, right? And then he goes, I've been looking for a way to reach high school kids, to talk to them about gangs. And he goes, I've been a police officer for years and years and years. And he goes, one of the things that a police officer tends to be when they're at the front of the room and they're speaking to kids, especially about a topic like gangs, is sometimes they become almost like Charlie Brown's teacher. You just wah, 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 right? Like, it's like kids are sitting there thinking, kids are savvy, the kids are ruthless, right? Yeah. So they're sitting there thinking, well, yeah, what do you know about being a gang? Or what do you know about being a drug dealer? How do you know what it's like to sit in jail? You put people in jail, you arrest these guys. Yeah. Maybe you have, you know what it's like to be a police officer, but you don't know what it's like to live that lifestyle. And so Lindsay goes, this is what I'm looking for. And I'm wondering if you would want to develop a presentation with me where it's both police perspective as well as your perspective. And so we sit down and we develop this presentation, and we start giving it to youth. And I remember the first 6 months that I did this presentation, I couldn't sleep the night before because I was so nervous, right? I would die of nerves. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat for the first day before, right? And it's hilarious.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, presenting, I tell people this all the time. I would present to a room of 1,000 adults.
Yeah.
versus if I had to talk to a room of 50 kids.
100%.
Oh my God.
Adults will smile, they'll nod, they'll tell you great job
Yeah.
almost no matter what.
Yeah.
Kids will sit there, they'll stare off into space, they'll look the other way, they'll talk to each other. If you can hold a youth audience, you are doing something right.
100%.
And it was hilarious because it went to the point where I couldn't sleep. But I would watch these kids when I went up and talked and told them about my life and told them about my ADHD diagnosis and told them about how different I felt and told them about the bad friends that I got hooked up with in my grade 8 year because I got caught shoplifting and my old friends kind of ditched me kind of thing. And I would watch them and they'd go like this. They would just almost nod at certain times. And you can tell they're thinking, hey, this is me. This is me that this guy is talking about.
Yeah.
Right. And then you move into my adult life, you move into my experience with gangs and you start to see that, hey, this guy's really telling us what happened to him. And he's not doing it in a way that's preachy. He's not doing it in a way that's telling us don't do this. My thing is always, if you're going to go join a gang, like there's not anything that I can do to stop you. If that's your motivation, good luck. Right. I'm not going to be able to stop you. But what I can do is share my experiences. What I can do is share a narrative with you that maybe you see yourself in, that maybe you take away from it. Hey, I don't want to end up in those bad situations. And so we started giving this presentation and it just took off. Like it was crazy how well it went. And then through that work, I met Rob Rye, who's the director of the Surrey School District. And he was another guy that said, I don't think you realize what you have here. And I don't think you realize the talent that you bring to this work, that the humanity, the emotion that you bring to people, right? He's like, I don't think you realize how you make people feel. And he goes, I want to give you a job at the school district.
Right.
And again, I thought, how is that even possible? Right? Like at this point, I still have a criminal record for production of substance, possession for the purpose of trafficking, possession of a restricted firearm with ammunition. Right? Like I'm thinking like, you're going to give me a job at the school district? And he goes, yeah, I'm going to try. And I'll never forget, he had to go in to the superintendent at the time. Yeah. And Rob's got this great line, and we always used it when we were doing risk assessments, you know, and I'd say, oh, we should just let this kid back. He'd go, would you bet your career on it? But he went into the superintendent and he goes, I'll never forget it. I went into the superintendent and say, hey, I have this great idea. I want to hire this ex-gang member who has this massive criminal record, and I want to let him work with kids, right? And it was interesting too because there was guys, like great guys like Joe Calendino had paved the way for this at the time. So like he was kind of the trailblazer of this type of work, of people doing this work who had an experiential past. And you know, so it wasn't quite as radical as it would have been at one point, right? I think they saw some success with Joe and thought, hey, we want to see if there's other people we can give these opportunities to, right? So, yeah, he basically said, yeah, let's let him work with kids. And the superintendent kind of goes, okay, yeah, let's give it a try. And sure enough, then I start working for the Surrey School District, and I transitioned through a number of various roles there. I worked in the wraparound program, worked with so many great kids. Kids who were struggling immensely with a lot of different issues, whether it was gang involvement, whether it was abject poverty, whether it was they were experiencing extreme amounts of discrimination and racism and things like that, and again just feeling othered by society. So hey, I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you what I'll become. You think I'm bad now, wait till you see me in 5 years type of mentality, right? But I worked with so many great kids through that program and eventually transitioned into being a substance use liaison. Work with a lot of kids that are experiencing substance use issues and misuse issues, and slowly it kind of went from there. And during that process I decide, hey, I'm going to go back and get my master's degree. Right. And so I decided to go back and get my master's degree, and it was one of those things where you just keep showing up and things keep happening. There was no predestination for any of this to happen. It was like and I think it's testament to the message that I try and give young people. It's just, if you show up and you keep happening, you show up on time, you do your best every single day, and you show up, and you never know what's going to happen. You know, if you're open to opportunities, if you're passionate, you never know where your life is going to take you. You never know what branches of that tree may grow. Because I can tell you right now, if you would have told me 15 years ago, I'd even be sitting here having this conversation with you, I would have thought you were insane, right? Never mind someone who's a registered clinical counselor, someone who has a master's degree in psychology, someone who has this career that he's passionate about. I never thought that was even possible for me, but the trick is it was possible the whole time. I just didn't see it.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's basically what you, in your private practice you mentioned, right? Is that what you have?
Yeah.
That's what you want to do. And what is that private practice, just so?
So I have a bunch of different contracts. So I work with individuals through a variety of mental health issues, things like that. One of the interesting things I also do as well is there's like, if you get caught drinking and driving, you have to take like this course. So I teach that course. That's always a fun aside for some great stories come out of that course. It's always an interesting one. But really being open to consulting, to working with school districts, to working with different law enforcement agencies, whether it's getting out and presenting on a bunch of different topics, whether it's presenting on my life, presenting on mental health stuff. Again, really just doing the case consults for complicated cases that certain school districts are working with at the time, kids that they're really struggling with, how to help them kind of thing. And so really just transitioning into that work over time. But one of the things that I really do love is I love the work with governmental organizations, whether it's working for the school district, whether it's, potentially working for the BC Public Service, right? Like one of the things I never want to be is the guy who talks about all the work he used to do.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Like I want to be doing this work all the time. I want to be current. I want to be relevant. Right. Because at the end of the day, like, you can transition into being this expert on certain topics. Right. But the expertise lies in the work.
Yeah.
Right. The expertise lies in the work. And you know this better than anybody with your role and who you are and how talented you are. This stuff changes literally overnight.
Yeah.
Like,
Exactly.
Talk about being tired. Like, how sick are you of social media apps at this point?
Oh man, my own usage of it is just, it's out the window. Like I always, it's exactly that everybody's trying to sell you something. And, you look at the patterns of grooming and recruiting, when you were in that role, in that time. And it's exact same, like you mentioned it, right? It's targeting younger audiences. It's getting to that like lizard brain, core basic needs quicker. And quicker, and having to keep up with that is such a huge thing. And it's something that's just, whether it's gang recruitment, whether it's exploitation, whether it's bullying or cyberbullying, there's always an uphill battle that it seems to be.
Yes. Yeah. And you talk about that lizard brain. It's interesting that you touched on that. It's so interesting to see how vulnerable young people are to poor decisions just based on the neurological, where they are at, like neurologically kind of thing in terms of brain development, how susceptible they are to bad choices, how especially teenage addiction can rewire the brain, to make it so much more likely that they're going to experience addiction as adults. To even look at like one of the things that I'm really, really interested in and continuously am learning about is whether it's adverse childhood experiences and the epigenetic, like the fact that you experience changes at a gene level from things like trauma, from things like abuse. We talk about whether it's intergenerational or historical trauma with residential schools and Indigenous people, or people that survived the Holocaust, and then you look down through their genealogy and they've had more issues. Is just the fact that trauma can be encoded into essentially our DNA, and realizing how vulnerable young people are at not only a gene level but at a brain level as well. But the great part about that is with them being that vulnerable to going off the rails, the flip side of that coin is how powerful it is to be able to help them learn, to be able to help them internalize things, to be able to rewire some of those adverse childhood experiences, to be able to provide supportive relationships. Looking at studies that show that some of these ACEs scores can be mitigated with proper relationships, with proper support, with therapy, with people that actually care about them, right? When you can pull them out of these abusive situations and you get to be the person that says, hey, I'm going to make sure and I'm going to do my best that this never happens to you again. How resilient young people can actually be if they're properly supported, right?
Yeah.
There's a flip side to that coin that I think we lose in the conversation all the time, because it's always risk factors. How do we keep kids, at-risk kids? How do we fix at-risk kids, right? You forget that with the right opportunities, the kids will fix themselves. And it's not to say that they'll, they don't need our help, but they'll find those branches on their own. They'll find their path on their own with the right support. Everybody has it inside of them already. It's just, how do you nurture it out of them? How do you pull it out of them?
Yeah.
And that to me is the most interesting part of the work.
Well, and I think that, you know, your background, your experience really helps solidify that, you know, this is core to you and helping these kids, which is fantastic. And I really like your story. And again, I feel like there's so much more that we can dive into in each one of these things. But just on like that 50,000 foot view, it also has that inspirational of, you know, no matter what situation you're in, like there's ways that you can work.
Yep.
Again, if you have those right tools, those right resources, where do you go get them, and how to kind of build yourself, because you are that success story from that. So if people wanted to reach out to you, what was the best way they could for any sort of consultation for your private practice? What's the best way to get out?
Probably LinkedIn. Yeah, I have a LinkedIn profile, so just search up my name, just Jordan Buna on LinkedIn. Send me a direct message on there. Is probably the easiest way to do it. To be honest with you, I'm been meaning to launch my website, and I'm very ADHD about it, so hopefully that's coming soon in the near future. But yeah, honestly, if you Google me, I have a very extensive online profile, and LinkedIn would probably be your best bet.
Right on.
Yeah.
There's so much more. I feel like we'll want to have you back to explore. But
I'm more than happy to do a part 2. It's always a pleasure, brother.
Yeah, no, Jordan, thank you so much for the time.
No problem.
It's been awesome.
No problem.
Cool.
Sweet.